The U.S. government has revalued gold twice in modern history, 1933 and 1971. And both times, the official story was that it saved the economy. Here's the paradox. The people who believed that story lost everything, while a small group who understood what was really happening became generationally wealthy. Most analysts will tell you these were emergency measures, necessary interventions, acts of economic salvation. But when you examine the mechanics, the actual flow of wealth, the timing, the beneficiaries, a different pattern emerges. And that pattern is repeating right now, in real time, while most people aren't even watching. Margaret Chen was 62 years old when she finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to tell her for 40 years. She was standing in her kitchen in San Francisco, reading a letter from her bank, when the realization hit. The letter explained that her pension fund, $340,000 she'd saved over 33 years as a public school teacher, had just lost 18% of its purchasing power in 6 months. Not because the stock market crashed, not because of fraud, but because of something the letter called necessary monetary adjustment. Margaret's hand shook as she read those words. Necessary monetary adjustment. Her grandmother had used almost the exact same phrase in 1971, the day President Nixon closed the gold window. "They're adjusting the money again, May," her grandmother had whispered in Cantonese, her face tight with old fear. "Just like Roosevelt did to my parents." Margaret had thought it was paranoia, old-world superstition. Now, holding this letter, she finally understood. Her grandmother hadn't been paranoid. She'd been traumatized. And she'd been right. Across the country, in Greenwich, Connecticut, Robert Ashford III was having a very different morning. Robert was 47, a hedge fund manager, and he'd just authorized the largest gold purchase in his firm's history. $400 million. Not in gold stocks, not in gold ETFs. Physical gold, sitting in a vault in Switzerland. His partners thought he was insane. Gold doesn't yield anything, they argued. It's a dead asset in a growing economy. Robert didn't try to convince them. He'd learned from his grandfather, who'd learned from his great-grandfather, who'd made a fortune in 1934 doing exactly what everyone said was crazy. When governments start talking about monetary flexibility, his grandfather had told him in 2008, smart money moves to what they can't print. Robert had been waiting 13 years for the signals to align. Now they were aligning. Fast. The thing most people get wrong about 1933 and 1971 isn't the economics. It's the psychology. They think these were reactive measures, desperate governments responding to crises. But when you look at the preparation, the timing, the systematic accumulation that happened in the months before each announcement, a different picture emerges. Someone knew, multiple someones, and they positioned themselves accordingly while the general public debated whether recovery was coming or if they should trust their leaders. The question isn't whether monetary revaluation happened. The question is, who knew it was coming and how they knew. In 1933, on April 5th, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, requiring all Americans to surrender their gold to the Federal Reserve at the official rate of $20.67 per ounce, except for small amounts, jewelry, collectibles, industrial use. The government called it necessary to fight the Depression. 7 months later, in January 1934, the government revalued gold to $35 per ounce. That's a 69% increase overnight. But American citizens couldn't own gold anymore. They'd been forced to sell at the old price. The only entities holding gold at the new valuation were the government itself and the banks that somehow received exemptions to accumulate gold in the months before the announcement. Where did that wealth transfer go? The official record doesn't say much, but family fortunes tell a different story. Thomas Whitmore was a bank examiner in New York in 1932. He was 31 years old, made $42 a week, and had a wife and 2 children in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn. According to his daughter's memoir, published in 1989 after everyone involved was dead, Thomas came home one evening in October 1932 and told his wife to sell everything they owned and buy gold coins. Not bars, coins. She thought he'd lost his mind. They had $68 in savings. He wanted to convert it all to gold and hide it. "The banks know something," he told her. "I've seen the telegrams. I've seen the accumulation. Something's coming." She trusted him. They bought gold coins at $20.67 per ounce. In April 1933, when the government demanded gold surrender, Thomas reported most of it. But he kept 12 coins hidden in the wall of their apartment. By 1934, when gold revalued to $35, those 12 coins represented 8 months of his salary. He never sold them. His daughter inherited them in 1978, sold them at $380 per ounce, and bought her first house. Thomas died in 1963, never admitting what he'd done, but teaching his daughter a lesson she never forgot. When the government starts talking about helping you, watch what the banks are doing for themselves. Now here's where it gets strange. 37 years later, in 1971, the exact same pattern repeated. Not with gold confiscation, that would have been too obvious. With decoupling. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods system that had linked the dollar to gold since 1944. The official story: this was temporary, necessary to fight inflation and protect American workers from currency manipulation by foreign governments. The actual result: the dollar lost 98% of its purchasing power over the next 50 years. But again, some people knew it was coming. Some people positioned themselves. And some people became extraordinarily wealthy, while everyone else argued about whether this was good or bad for America. Jennifer Nakamura's father was a currency trader in Tokyo in 1970. She was 8 years old. Years later, in an interview, she recalled the night her father came home, locked himself in his study, and spent 4 hours on the phone with someone in New York. When he emerged, he told her mother, in Japanese, that they needed to move every dollar they owned into Swiss francs and German marks immediately. Her mother protested. They'd just bought their first house with a dollar-denominated mortgage. "The mortgage is good," her father said. "Dollar debt. But dollar savings will burn." By September 1971, 1 month after Nixon's announcement, the dollar had lost 11% against major currencies. By 1973, it had lost 38%. Jennifer's father paid off their entire mortgage with devalued dollars, while his currency positions tripled. He'd turned $180,000 in savings into $540,000 in 2 years. Not through speculation, through understanding what was actually happening beneath the official narrative. When Jennifer asked him, decades later, how he'd known, he said something that stayed with her. "Central banks don't lie with words. They lie with timing. When they say something is temporary, watch how permanent their preparations are." But for every person who understood, thousands didn't. Helen Brickman was 56 in 1971, a widow with $82,000 in savings, her late husband's life insurance and pension. She kept it in treasury bonds because that's what everyone said was safe. Government-backed, guaranteed. By 1981, inflation had destroyed 64% of her purchasing power. The $82,000 could buy what $29,000 bought in 1971. She died in 1989, bitter and broke, in a state-subsidized nursing home, still convinced she'd done everything right. She had, according to the advice of her time. And that's exactly the problem. So why does this matter now? Because the signals that preceded 1933 and 1971 aren't historical curiosities. They're a pattern, and that pattern is repeating with precision that should terrify anyone paying attention. Central banks are accumulating gold at rates not seen since 1971. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, just published guidance on gold valuation that mirrors language used in 1932. Legislation is moving through Congress that creates mechanisms for gold revaluation without public vote. And the people who understand what these signals mean aren't arguing about it on cable news. They're quietly, systematically positioning themselves for what comes next. The wealth transfer won't announce itself with headlines. It'll happen in the gap between when officials say, "We're just exploring options," and when they say, "This is now policy." And by the time the general public realizes what happened, the transfer will be complete. Just like 1933, just like 1971. The only question is, which side of the transfer will you be on when the announcement comes? To understand what's happening now, you need to understand something most people never learn. Money isn't what you think it is. And I don't mean that in some philosophical sense. I mean mechanically, structurally, legally. Money operates on rules that are hidden in plain sight. And those rules have changed 3 times in American history. Each time, the change was presented as salvation. Each time, it was actually a transfer. And each time, the people who understood the mechanics became wealthy, while everyone else wondered what happened. Let's start with the simplest question. What is money? Most people would say it's a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of account. That's what textbooks teach. But here's what they don't teach. Money is a claim on real resources, and whoever controls the issuance of money controls who gets those resources. In 1913, that control shifted from the Treasury to the Federal Reserve, a private consortium of banks given monopoly power over the money supply, not through revolution, through legislation. The Federal Reserve Act passed on December 23, 1913, when most of Congress was home for Christmas. Think about that timing. The most significant monetary legislation in American history passed when almost nobody was paying attention. Daniel Price was a journalist in Washington in 1913. He was 28 years old, working for a small newspaper that nobody remembers now. But Daniel kept meticulous diaries, and those diaries survived. In an entry from December 20th, 1913, 3 days before the vote, Daniel wrote, "Strange atmosphere in the Capitol today. The big financial reporters have all left for holiday. The congressional record shows 17 senators absent. Yet the banking bill, which has been debated for 6 months, is suddenly scheduled for final vote on the 23rd. Spoke with Senator Aldrich's aide off record. He smiled and said, "Sometimes the best time to make history is when nobody's writing it down." The Federal Reserve Act passed 43 to 25 in the Senate. Most Americans didn't learn about it until January, after it was law. Daniel's newspaper ran a small story on page 7. The New York Times put it on the front page, but framed it as technical banking reform, not a fundamental restructuring of monetary power. 20 years later, when Roosevelt confiscated gold, Daniel would remember that vote and understand why it had to happen when it did. You can't force citizens to surrender gold unless you first control the money supply. The sequence matters. Here's the mechanism most people miss. Before 1913, banks could fail. If you made bad loans, extended too much credit, ran out of reserves, you went bankrupt. Your depositors lost money. This created discipline. Banks had to be careful because failure meant destruction. But after 1913, The Federal Reserve could create unlimited reserves. If a bank ran into trouble, the Fed could provide liquidity. This meant banks could take bigger risks because the Fed would backstop them, which meant more lending, which meant more debt, which meant more claims on future production. See the pattern? The money supply wasn't constrained by gold anymore. It was constrained by confidence. As long as people believed the system worked, it worked. And when confidence faltered, the Fed could print more reserves to restore it. Except there was one problem. The dollar was still legally tied to gold. Every dollar was redeemable for a fixed amount of gold. This created a limit. The Fed couldn't print infinite dollars because eventually someone would demand gold redemption. And that's where 1933 comes in. By 1932, the banking system was over-leveraged by a factor of 12 to 1. For every dollar of gold backing, $12 of claims existed. This wasn't fraud. This was the system working as designed. Fractional reserve banking. But in 1932, people started asking for their gold. Not because they understood monetary mechanics, because they were scared. The Depression was grinding into its third year. Banks were failing. People wanted something tangible, and the Fed couldn't meet that demand without either admitting the system was insolvent or changing the rules. So they changed the rules. Executive Order 6102 wasn't an economic emergency measure. It was a legal prerequisite for monetary expansion. You can't expand the money supply beyond your gold reserves if citizens can demand gold redemption. So first, you confiscate the gold. Then you revalue it higher. Then you issue more currency against the higher valuation. The wealth transfer is automatic. Citizens surrendered gold at $20 per ounce. Government revalued it to $35 per ounce. That 69% increase in gold's value didn't benefit the people who surrendered it. It benefited the entity holding it, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. They could now issue more dollars per ounce of gold held. More currency issuance meant more government spending, more bank lending, more economic activity. But it also meant dilution. Every existing dollar lost purchasing power because more dollars chased the same amount of goods. The people who surrendered their gold received dollars that were worth less than the gold they gave up. That's not a side effect. That's the mechanism. Ruth Morrison was 41 years old in 1933, running a boarding house in Philadelphia. She had $86 in gold coins saved from 10 years of work. When the government demanded surrender, she complied, because the alternative was 10 years in prison. She received 86 paper dollars in exchange. Over the next 6 years, those $86 bought progressively less, as food prices, rent, clothing costs, all adjusted to the new money supply. By 1939, her purchasing power had fallen 32%. She wasn't robbed by criminals. She was deluded by policy. And here's what most people get wrong about that era. They think the gold confiscation was about helping the economy recover. But if you actually wanted to help working people like Ruth, you wouldn't force them to surrender their savings. You'd let them keep the gold and benefit from the revaluation. The fact that this didn't happen tells you who the policy was designed to help. And it wasn't Ruth. But here's the micro hook you need to understand before we go further. The 1933 gold confiscation only worked because most Americans didn't see it coming. Thomas Whitmore did, because he was inside the banking system and saw the preparation. But Ruth Morrison didn't. She trusted the official narrative, and that trust cost her a third of her life savings. The question isn't whether this could happen again. The question is whether you're watching the preparation this time or trusting the narrative. Fast forward to 1971. Different decade, different mechanism, same pattern. By the late 1960s, the Bretton Woods system, which pegged the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce, and pegged other currencies to the dollar, was breaking down. Why? Because America had printed more dollars than it had gold to back them. Not accidentally, deliberately. To fund the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, Cold War military spending, the government needed more spending capacity than gold reserves allowed. So it printed anyway, assuming nobody would call the bluff. France did. Charles de Gaulle, in 1965, started demanding gold redemption for dollars. Other countries followed. By 1971, the U.S. gold reserves were falling fast. Nixon faced a choice: admit insolvency by continuing redemptions until gold ran out, or change the rules again. On August 15, 1971, he closed the gold window. No more gold redemption. The dollar became pure fiat, backed by nothing except the government's promise that it was money. The official story: temporary measure to fight currency speculators and protect American workers. The actual result? Permanent severing of the dollar from any tangible anchor, allowing unlimited monetary expansion, creating the inflation that destroyed purchasing power for the next decade and continues today. Michael Strauss was a steel worker in Pittsburgh in 1971. He was 34 years old, made $12,800 a year, and had $4,200 saved for his kids' college fund. The week after Nixon's announcement, Michael asked his union representative what it meant. The rep said, "Don't worry, it's temporary. The dollar is still strong. America is still America." Michael believed him. By 1981, that $4,200 had the purchasing power of $1,500. His kids didn't go to college. They went to work in the same mills he did, until those mills closed in the 80s. Michael died in 1997, never fully understanding what had been done to him. But Margaret Chen's grandmother understood. She'd seen it before. She knew the pattern. And she'd tried to warn Margaret, who finally remembered that warning when her own pension lost 18% in 6 months. Here's the contrarian point nobody wants to hear. These weren't mistakes. They weren't panicked reactions to unforeseen crises. They were planned transitions from one monetary regime to another, timed to maximize compliance and minimize resistance. You don't pass the Federal Reserve Act on December 23rd by accident. You don't confiscate gold in 1933 and then revalue it 7 months later without having planned the sequence. You don't close the gold window in 1971 without having already coordinated with other central banks about what comes next. The preparation always precedes the announcement, and the people who see the preparation are the people who position themselves correctly. So what's the mechanism actually doing? Think of it like this. Imagine you and 9 neighbors own a well that produces 100 gallons of water a day. You each own 10% of the well, so you each get 10 gallons. Now imagine one neighbor gains control of the well's management. He can't change how much water the well produces, but he can issue water certificates, pieces of paper that represent claims on future water production. At first, he issues 100 certificates, each worth 1 gallon. But then he issues more certificates, 200, then 300, to fund projects, pay debts, maintain power. The well still produces 100 gallons, but now 300 certificates exist. Each certificate is worth less water. If you hold certificates, you've been diluted. But if you hold ownership of the actual well, if you own a share of the physical asset producing the resource, you're protected. That's what gold is in monetary terms. It's ownership of the physical asset. Currency is the certificate, the claim. And when governments need more claims than assets justify, they either confiscate the asset or sever the connection between asset and claim. Either way, certificate holders get diluted, while asset holders get protected. The reason this matters now is simple. The signals that preceded 1933 and 1971 aren't abstract warnings. They're specific, observable, measurable preparations. And those preparations are happening again. Not in secret. In public records, central bank statements, legislative proposals, gold accumulation data. The pattern is repeating with such precision that you'd almost think someone was following a playbook. And maybe they are. Because the third transition, the one we're watching in real time, isn't a surprise to people who understand how the mechanism works. It's inevitable. The only question is timing. And based on what happened in 1933 and 1971, when the announcement finally comes, it'll come fast. It'll be framed as necessary, and it'll be over before most people understand what just happened. Here's what they don't tell you in history books. The night before Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, certain banks received telegrams. Not all banks, specific banks. The telegrams were brief, coded, but clear enough for those who needed to understand. By dawn on April 5, 1933, when the order became law, those banks had already moved their gold holdings into exempt categories: industrial use, artistic purposes, numismatic collections. Legal loopholes built into the order itself, written by the same people who would benefit from them. The general public had 25 days to surrender their gold. But the people who wrote the order had months to prepare. And that timing, that gap between preparation and announcement, is where the entire transfer happened. Sarah Goldstein was 39 years old in April 1933, living in Boston, running a small jewelry manufacturing business she'd inherited from her father. She had 42 ounces of gold in raw form for her work. When the order came, she reported it because that's what the law required. 2 weeks later, a bank examiner showed up at her shop. He inspected her books, checked her inventory, verified her surrender. Professional, thorough, cold. Then he asked if she knew about the exemption for artistic use. Sarah said no. He smiled. She remembered that smile for the rest of her life, and told her the exemption had been in the order from day one, available to anyone who filed the right paperwork with the right office before the deadline. Sarah asked what deadline. He said it had passed 3 days ago. Sarah lost 42 ounces of gold worth $867. The bank examiner worked for an institution that, according to later congressional testimony in 1934, had filed exemption paperwork for 2,000 ounces 3 weeks before the order was announced. Not illegal, just informed. Sarah's business closed in 1935. The bank bought her building at auction in 1936 for 18 cents on the dollar. The examiner, who smiled at her, became a branch manager. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are property records, employment records, testimony entered into congressional record. The information is public. The pattern is clear. But somehow, we've convinced ourselves it was all just necessary economic policy. Now here's the first micro-hook you need to catch. If the gold confiscation was really about fighting the Depression, about helping ordinary Americans survive economic catastrophe, why were exemptions built in from the start? Why were those exemptions complex enough that you needed insider knowledge to use them? And why was the revaluation from $20 to $35 per ounce announced only after the surrender deadline had passed? You don't design a system that way, unless the design itself is the point. Let's talk about who knew. Not conspiracies, facts. In January 1933, 3 months before the gold order, J.P. Morgan & Company purchased $120 million in gold bullion through European intermediaries. The transaction records exist. They're in the National Archives. No law was broken. Americans could still own gold in January. But why would a major bank, in the depths of the Depression, with liquidity crises everywhere, invest $120 million in an asset that officially paid no yield? Either they were monumentally stupid, or they knew something. By April, when the order forced citizens to surrender gold at $20 per ounce, Morgan's gold was safely held through foreign subsidiaries, exempt from U.S. jurisdiction. By January 1934, when gold revalued to $35, Morgan's position had gained 69%. That's $82.8 million in profit. Not from production, not from innovation, from positioning. From knowing the rule change was coming before the rule change was announced. Remember Thomas Whitmore from Part 1? The bank examiner who hid 12 gold coins in his wall? Thomas saw the telegrams in October 1932. He noticed the accumulation patterns. He couldn't prove intent, but he understood mechanism. And mechanism told him something was coming. Thomas made $42 a week. J.P. Morgan made $82.8 million on the same policy shift. Both understood the same pattern. One had 12 gold coins. The other had $120 million in positioning capital. That's not a difference in intelligence. That's a difference in access. And that difference is the entire story of monetary revaluation. Some people get advance notice through access, position themselves accordingly, and profit enormously, while everyone else scrambles to understand what just happened after it's already over. But here's what most people get wrong about 1933. They think the wealth transfer was a side effect, an unintended consequence of emergency policy. That's not how it worked. The wealth transfer was the mechanism through which the policy worked. The government needed more monetary flexibility to spend, to fund programs, to expand the money supply. But the dollar was tied to gold at $20 per ounce. That created a limit. To break the limit, they needed more gold at the new valuation, or less gold in public hands. Confiscation accomplished both. Citizens surrendered gold at the old price. Government held gold at the new price. The difference wasn't lost. It was transferred from citizens to government, from savers to spenders, from people who held assets to people who issued currency. That transfer funded the New Deal. Those programs weren't paid for with taxes alone. They were paid for with purchasing power extracted from everyone who surrendered gold, then received devalued dollars as government spending pushed prices higher through the 30s. We celebrate the New Deal as salvation, but we don't talk about who paid for it, and we definitely don't talk about who knew how the payment mechanism worked. Now jump to 1971. Different era, same pattern, better execution. Remember Jennifer Nakamura's father from Part 2? The currency trader who moved everything into Swiss francs and German marks the week before Nixon closed the gold window. He wasn't psychic. He was watching the same signals Thomas Whitmore watched in 1932. In July 1971, 1 month before Nixon's announcement, the U.S. Treasury made an unusual gold sale to settle international accounts. The transaction was small, $200 million, but the timing was strange. Why sell gold in July if you're not anticipating a rule change in August? Jennifer's father saw that sale and understood. The Treasury was managing optics, creating the appearance of normal operations, right before announcing that gold redemption was finished. He called his contact in New York, a banker who wouldn't confirm anything but said, off record, "If you're holding dollars, I'd diversify before September." That was enough. Jennifer's father moved $180,000 across 3 currencies in 2 days. By September, when the dollar had lost 11%, his positions had gained 32% in dollar terms. That $180,000 became $237,600. Not from speculation, from reading preparation. But here's the rage moment, the part that should make you stop and really think about what happened. While Jennifer's father was protecting his family's savings, while J.P. Morgan was positioning gold holdings through foreign subsidiaries, ordinary Americans were being told that dollars were safer than gold, that the Bretton Woods system was stable, that foreign speculators were the problem. Paul Volcker, then Undersecretary of the Treasury, gave a speech on August 10, 1971, 5 days before Nixon's announcement, assuring foreign central banks that the gold window would remain open, that the dollar's gold backing was solid, that rumors of policy changes were unfounded. 5 days later, Nixon closed the gold window permanently. Was Volcker lying? Or was he compartmentalized, kept out of the decision until the last moment? Either answer is damning. Either the Treasury's second-ranking official was lying to foreign governments, while insiders positioned themselves, or policy was so tightly controlled that even high-ranking officials were kept in the dark until announcement. Either way, the gap between what officials said publicly and what they knew privately created the space for wealth transfer. And the people on the wrong side of that gap, people like Michael Strauss, the Pittsburgh steelworker who lost 2/3 of his purchasing power by 1981, paid the price. Pause this video right now and ask yourself, who were the winners and losers in 1971? Not philosophically, specifically. Who held dollar-denominated savings that got destroyed by inflation? Working people, middle-class families, retirees on fixed pensions, people who trusted the official guidance that dollars were safe. Who held dollar-denominated debt that got paid back with devalued currency? Corporations, real estate investors, people who understood that inflation destroys savers but rewards borrowers. Who held hard assets, real estate, commodities, foreign currency, gold through offshore accounts that appreciated as the dollar fell? Institutions, wealthy individuals with access to sophisticated planning, people who got the memo before the announcement. This wasn't random. This was mechanical. The policy produced predictable winners and losers, and the predictability tells you the policy was designed exactly as it functioned. Here's the second micro-hook. Every major monetary shift in American history has followed the same three-step sequence. Step 1. Insiders accumulate the asset that will benefit from revaluation, or position against the asset that will be devalued. Step 2. Policy changes in ways that transfer value from public holdings to institutional holdings, or from savers to debtors. Step 3. The change is framed as necessary, temporary, unavoidable, beneficial to the general welfare. And by the time the general public understands what happened, the transfer is complete and irreversible. This happened in 1933. This happened in 1971. And if you're watching the same sequence unfold now, in 2024 and 2025, you're not paranoid. You're pattern matching correctly. Let me show you what I mean with one more story. Eleanor Vasquez was 68 years old in 1971, living in Phoenix. She was a retired school teacher with a modest pension, $420 a month, and $31,000 in savings, all in a bank account earning 4% interest. Safe, conservative, responsible. When Nixon closed the gold window, Eleanor asked her bank manager what it meant for her savings. He told her, and this is documented in a letter she wrote to her sister that survived in family archives. He told her the dollar was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, that her savings were FDIC insured, that nothing had fundamentally changed. Technically, he was right. Her account was insured. But insurance protects against bank failure, not purchasing power destruction. By 1981, Eleanor's $31,000 had the buying power of $11,100. She didn't lose her money. She lost what her money could buy. And the difference between those two things, the difference between nominal value and real value, is where the entire transfer happens. Eleanor died in 1986, confused about why her responsible saving had left her poor. Meanwhile, the institutions that borrowed heavily in the 60s and 70s paid back their debts with devalued dollars, effectively writing down their obligations by 60 to 70% in real terms. Eleanor subsidized their debt reduction with her destroyed savings. Not through taxation, through inflation, through monetary policy, through mechanisms she didn't understand and wasn't told about until it was too late. Here's the contrarian point that makes people uncomfortable. These transfers aren't failures of policy. They're functions of policy. When you create a system where a small group controls money issuance and can change the rules governing that issuance, wealth transfer is inevitable. It's not a bug. It's the feature. And every time someone like Margaret Chen or Ruth Morrison or Eleanor Vasquez loses purchasing power to inflation or currency devaluation or mandatory asset surrender, someone else gains. The money doesn't evaporate. It moves. From citizens to government. From savers to debtors. From people who hold currency to people who hold assets or debts denominated in that currency. This isn't a moral judgment. This is mechanical reality. And the sooner you understand the mechanics, the sooner you can position yourself on the right side of the next transfer. Because here's what nobody wants to say out loud. The pattern isn't breaking. It's accelerating. The gap between what central banks are doing and what they're saying publicly is wider now than at any point since 1971. The accumulation patterns, gold purchases by central banks, legislative preparation for revaluation mechanisms, coordination between Treasury and Fed that mirrors 1933 and 1971 are all present, visible, measurable. The only question left is timing. When will the announcement come? And more importantly, when it does come, will you be positioned like Thomas Whitmore, who hid 12 gold coins and protected his family? Or like Ruth Morrison, who trusted the system and lost a third of her savings? Because that decision, that choice to see the pattern or ignore it, is the only thing separating the people who survive monetary transitions from the people who get destroyed by them. The thing about monetary transfers is they don't announce themselves with explosions. There's no moment where everything collapses and everyone realizes what happened. Instead, it's a slow erosion, measured in decades, felt in the quiet desperation of people who did everything right, but somehow ended up poor anyway. Ruth Morrison, who surrendered her 86 gold coins in 1933, didn't understand she'd been robbed until 1947, 14 years later, when she tried to buy the same groceries she'd bought in 1933 and discovered her money bought half as much. Not because of a crisis, because of the structural consequence of confiscation followed by currency expansion. The government needed those gold reserves to issue more dollars, to fund programs, to inflate the money supply. And every new dollar issued reduced the purchasing power of every existing dollar. Ruth felt it at the grocery store, at the rent office, at the doctor's office. Death by 1,000 price increases, each one small enough to rationalize. All of them together, devastating enough to destroy her standard of living. By 1952, 19 years after surrendering her gold, Ruth was 71 years old and working part-time as a cleaning woman because her savings, what remained after inflation ate through them, couldn't cover her expenses. The $86 she'd received for her gold in 1933 would need to be $156 in 1952 just to maintain the same purchasing power. But she still had $86 in her account, plus 19 years of meager interest, bringing her total to about $93. She'd lost 40% of her real wealth simply by holding currency instead of the asset the currency claimed to represent. Ruth died in 1958, broke and bitter, convinced she'd failed financially. But she hadn't failed. The system had transferred her wealth, slowly and legally, to fund spending programs she never voted for, using mechanisms she never understood. That's not failure. That's extraction. Now contrast Ruth with the family that employed Thomas Whitmore. Remember, Thomas was the bank examiner who hid 12 gold coins in 1932, surrendered most of his gold, but kept those 12 hidden. His daughter inherited them in 1978 and sold them at $380 per ounce. 12 ounces at $380 equals $4,560. In 1933, those same 12 ounces at the official $20.67 rate would have been worth $248. If Thomas had surrendered those coins and held the $248 in currency from 1933 to 1978, accounting for inflation, that $248 would need to be about $1,430 to maintain purchasing power. But actual savings accounts from that era, with interest, would have grown $248 to maybe $890 by 1978. Thomas's daughter got $4,560 for the same starting asset. That's a 512% advantage over someone who followed the rules. Not because Thomas was smarter than Ruth. Both understood the same basic economics, but because Thomas understood one critical thing Ruth didn't. In monetary transitions, the people who hold the underlying asset survive, and the people who hold claims on the asset get diluted. It's not a moral lesson, it's a mechanical reality. But here's the first micro hook you need to catch. The 10-year trajectory matters more than the 1-year impact. In 1934, 1 year after confiscation, Ruth had lost maybe 8% of her purchasing power. Noticeable, but survivable. By 1943, 10 years later, she'd lost 32%. Devastating, but she was still functioning. By 1953, 20 years later, she'd lost 56% and was working as a cleaning woman at 72 years old. The destruction wasn't immediate. It compounded. And that compounding is what makes monetary transfers so effective. By the time victims understand what happened, reversal is impossible. The wealth is gone. Transferred. Spent. Irretrievable. Now let's talk about 1971 and what happened to people like Michael Strauss, the Pittsburgh steelworker who had $4,200 saved in 1971 for his kids' college fund. Michael didn't panic when Nixon closed the gold window. He listened to his union rep, trusted the official line that this was temporary, kept his money in the bank earning 5% interest. By 1981, 10 years later, inflation had destroyed his savings. That $4,200, with 10 years of 5% interest, had grown nominally to about $6,843. But in real purchasing power, accounting for cumulative inflation of 137% from 1971 to 1981, that's $6,843 could buy what $2,888 bought in 1971. Michael had actually lost 31% of his real wealth, despite earning interest every year. His kids didn't go to college. They went to work at the same steel mill, which closed in 1984, when foreign competition, enabled by currency fluctuations that made American steel expensive, destroyed the industry. Michael's family went from working class with savings to working class without savings, to unemployed, to welfare over 13 years. Not because Michael made bad decisions, because the monetary system Michael trusted transferred his wealth to people who understood debt benefits from inflation. Now contrast Michael with someone who understood the same pattern Jennifer Nakamura's father understood in 1971. David Rothman was 42 years old in 1971, a real estate developer in Los Angeles. When Nixon closed the gold window, David didn't ask his accountant what it meant for his savings. He asked what it meant for his debts. David had $2.3 million in mortgage debt on properties he owned, all financed at fixed interest rates between 1968 and 1970. That debt was denominated in dollars. When the dollar devalued against foreign currencies and inflation accelerated domestically, David's debt burden fell in real terms, while his property values, anchored to tangible assets, rose. By 1981, David's properties had appreciated nominally to $8.7 million. His debt, still $2.3 million, now represented only 26% of his asset value, instead of the 70% it represented in 1971. And because he was paying back that debt with inflated dollars that bought less but satisfied the fixed debt amount, his effective debt reduction through inflation was about $1.4 million in real terms. David didn't earn $1.4 million. He extracted it from the monetary system, while people like Michael Strauss, who held currency instead of assets and savings instead of debt, lost equivalent amounts. Zero-sum game. Michael's loss was David's gain. Not through fraud, through understanding how the mechanism works. But here's what most people get wrong about the post-1971 era. They think the inflation of the 70s was a side effect of oil shocks and fiscal mismanagement. Oil shocks happened. Fiscal mismanagement happened. But the underlying driver was structural. The dollar had been severed from gold, removing the constraint on money creation, enabling unlimited monetary expansion that manifested as price inflation. And the people who understood that structural change positioned themselves in assets and debt. The people who didn't stayed in savings and got destroyed. By 1985, 14 years after Nixon's announcement, the cumulative inflation since 1971 was 184%. A dollar in 1985 bought what 35 cents bought in 1971. Every person who held currency savings lost 65 cents on every dollar. Every person who held dollar-denominated debt paid back that debt with 35-cent dollars, effectively writing down their obligations by 65%. The transfer was mathematical, predictable, devastating for one group, enriching for another. Let me show you what this looks like in human terms across a full generation. Eleanor Vasquez, who we met in Part 3, had $31,000 in savings in 1971 at age 68. By 1981, at 78, her $31,000 plus 10 years of interest had grown nominally to about $51,800. But in real purchasing power, that $51,800 could buy what $21,800 bought in 1971. Eleanor had lost $9,200 in real wealth, nearly 30%, despite earning interest, despite doing nothing wrong, despite following every conventional wisdom about safe saving. She died in 1986 at 83. Her remaining savings worth about $18,400 in 1971 purchasing power, having lost 40% of her real wealth over 15 years simply by holding currency. Compare that to institutions that borrowed heavily in the 60s, corporations, real estate trusts, infrastructure projects financed with long-term bonds. They paid back 1960s debt with 1980s dollars, effectively discharging obligations at 30 to 40 cents on the dollar in real terms. Eleanor's destroyed purchasing power funded their debt reduction. Her loss was their gain. The system worked exactly as designed. Now here's the international contrast that reveals how deliberate this was. In Switzerland, during the same period from 1971 to 1985, the Swiss franc maintained purchasing power far better than the dollar because Swiss monetary policy remained anchored to gold reserves and strict limits on money creation. A person who held Swiss francs from 1971 to 1985 lost about 18% to inflation. A person who held US dollars lost 65%. That 47-point difference represents the cost of America's monetary policy choice. Americans didn't lose purchasing power because of global forces beyond control. They lost it because American policymakers chose unlimited monetary expansion over price stability, chose to benefit debtors over savers, chose to transfer wealth from citizens to government, and from working class to asset-holding class. The Swiss made different choices and got different results, which proves the American results weren't inevitable. They were chosen. Here's the second microhook. If you're watching this in 2025, wondering whether the pattern could repeat, ask yourself what Margaret Chen's $340,000 in pension savings will be worth in 2035 if we follow the same trajectory. If the dollar loses 65% of its purchasing power over the next 10 years, matching the 1971 to 1981 pattern, Margaret's $340,000 will buy what $119,000 buys today. She'll lose $221,000 in real wealth by holding currency-denominated savings instead of positioning in assets. And somewhere, someone who understands this pattern is right now taking on debt denominated in dollars, buying hard assets, positioning themselves to benefit from the same transfer that destroyed Eleanor and is destroying Margaret. Not because they're villains, because they understand mechanism. Let me give you one more long-term trajectory to make this concrete. James Whitfield was 53 years old in 2015, a middle manager at a manufacturing company, earning $78,000 a year with $180,000 in his 401k, all in stable value funds and bond indexes, because he was close to retirement and wanted safety. Between 2015 and 2025, despite market gains that benefited equity holders, James's safe investments grew nominally to about $285,000. But cumulative inflation over that decade, especially accelerating after 2020, reduced his real purchasing power. In 2025 dollars, his $285,000 buys what $207,000 bought in 2015. He lost $73,000 in real wealth by being safe. Now project that forward to 2035. If James keeps his retirement savings in bonds and stable value funds, and if inflation averages 7% annually over the next decade, not extreme, just persistent, his $285,000 will grow nominally to about $560,000 by 2035. But in real purchasing power, that $560,000 will buy what $284,000 buys in 2025 terms. James will have worked his entire career, saved responsibly, followed expert advice, and ended up with less real wealth at 73 than he had at 63. Not because he failed, because the monetary system is designed to transfer wealth from savers to asset holders and debtors. Now contrast James with his coworker, Lisa Chen, no relation to Margaret, who is 47 in 2025. Lisa has $165,000 in her 401k, but positioned differently. 60% in real assets, real estate investment trusts, commodity funds, international holdings. 40% in equities, 0 in bonds. She also bought a rental property in 2022 with $40,000 down and a $360,000 mortgage at 6.5% fixed for 30 years. If the same inflationary pattern that destroyed Eleanor and is degrading James continues, Lisa's positions will perform very differently. Her real asset holdings will appreciate with inflation. Her rental income will increase with rent inflation. And her $360,000 mortgage debt will be paid back with devalued dollars. By 2035, Lisa's 401k could be worth $485,000 nominally, but more importantly, $380,000 in real terms, actual purchasing power growth. Her rental property, bought for $400,000 in 2022, could be worth $720,000 nominally in 2035, with only $285,000 remaining on the mortgage. Her real wealth will have grown substantially while James's stagnated. Same company, same salary levels, different understanding of how the mechanism works. And here's the contrarian point that makes people uncomfortable. Lisa isn't smarter than James. She's not more hardworking. She's not morally superior. She just understands that in a fiat currency system where the money supply expands faster than the real economy, holding currency claims destroys wealth, while holding real assets and real debts preserves it. That's not a personality trait. That's pattern recognition. And the fact that this pattern recognition separates winners from losers over decades tells you the system is designed to reward the informed and punish the trusting. Not accidentally, structurally. The 10-year trajectory is everything. 1 year of inflation seems manageable. 10 years compounds into devastation. 20 years creates permanent class separation between people who understood the monetary transition and people who trusted the official narrative. We're watching that separation happen right now. Margaret Chen is on track to lose 60% of her pension's purchasing power by 2035 if current patterns hold. Robert Ashford, the hedge fund manager who bought $400 million in physical gold, is positioned to preserve and likely multiply his real wealth over the same period. The gap between them isn't intelligence or effort. It's access to information and understanding of mechanism. And that gap, created by monetary policy most people don't understand and can't control, will determine their financial outcomes more than any career decision, investment choice, or personal sacrifice they make. Because when the rules of money itself change, everything else becomes secondary to positioning on the right side of the transfer. Remember Margaret Chen from the opening? 62 years old, standing in her kitchen, holding a letter explaining her pension had lost 18% of its purchasing power in 6 months through necessary monetary adjustment? That letter arrived in October 2024. Margaret is still trying to understand what happened. But her grandmother, who lived through 1971, would recognize the language immediately. Because the pattern isn't historical, it's current. And it's accelerating. In March 2023, central banks globally purchased 1,037 metric tons of gold, the highest quarterly accumulation since records began in 1950. Not during a crisis, during supposed stability. China's central bank reported adding to reserves for 17 consecutive months through December 2024. Poland announced plans to increase gold reserves from 8.3% to 20% of total reserves. Singapore quietly moved physical gold holdings from London to domestic vaults. These aren't random decisions by individual countries. This is coordinated preparation. And if you've been paying attention for the last 60 minutes, you know what preparation preceding announcement means. The question isn't whether something is coming. The question is what you're doing with the time between now and when it arrives. Here's what most people miss. The signals before 1933 weren't secret. They were public. Congressional hearings discussed gold policy throughout 1932. Banking journals analyzed reserve ratios and redemption pressures. The information was available. But most people didn't know to look for it, didn't understand what it meant when they saw it, or dismissed it as technical noise that didn't affect ordinary life. Ruth Morrison had access to the same information as Thomas Whitmore. She just didn't know it was information. And that gap, between data being public and people recognizing its significance, is where the entire transfer happens. Today, in 2025, you can access Federal Reserve balance sheets, Treasury gold holdings, central bank purchase data, legislative proposals on gold revaluation mechanisms. All public, all available. The question is, are you looking? And if you're looking, do you understand what you're seeing? Let me show you what's happening right now that mirrors 1932 and 1970. In July 2023, the House Financial Services Committee held hearings on modernizing gold valuation for monetary flexibility. Not front-page news, barely covered outside specialized financial press. But the language in those hearings, updating antiquated mechanisms, creating flexibility for emergency circumstances, ensuring Treasury has tools to respond to future crises, mirrors almost exactly the language used in congressional hearings in 1932 about gold policy. The people testifying weren't proposing confiscation. They were proposing revaluation. Specifically, they discussed mechanisms to revalue Treasury gold holdings from the current statutory price of $42.22 per ounce, a relic from 1973, to current market prices, around $2,050 per ounce. That's a 4,754% increase. And here's the mechanism. If Treasury revalues its 261 million ounces of gold from $42.22 to $2,050, the Treasury's gold asset value increases from $11 billion to $535 billion. That's $524 billion in new assets created through accounting adjustment. Assets that could back new currency issuance, new government spending, new monetary expansion. Sound familiar? It's the same mechanism used in 1934. Legal. Official. Presented as technical modernization, but mechanically identical to what transferred wealth from Ruth Morrison to the institutions that wrote the policy. Now here's the twist nobody's talking about. Who benefits from gold revaluation in 2025? Not citizens. Americans can own gold now, unlike 1933, but most don't. Only about 2% of American households hold any physical gold. Most wealth is in currency-denominated assets, stocks, bonds, savings accounts, pensions like Margaret's. When Treasury revalues gold and issues new currency against those reserves, the dilution effect hits currency holders. The 2% who own gold benefit from higher valuations. The 98% who don't own gold experience purchasing power loss as new money chases the same goods. It's the same transfer as 1933, just without the confiscation step. More efficient, less visible, equally effective. David Kim is 39 years old, lives in Austin, works in tech, earns $240,000 a year, has $890,000 in retirement accounts, all in index funds, and $120,000 in savings. Smart, successful, informed. David reads financial news. He knows about inflation. He's vaguely aware that things cost more now. But when I ask him about central bank gold accumulation, Treasury revaluation proposals, or the historical pattern of monetary transitions, he has no framework for understanding why it matters to him personally. David's entire financial position is denominated in dollars or dollar-based claims. If the pattern repeats, if gold revaluation enables monetary expansion that creates sustained 7 to 10% inflation over the next decade, David's $890,000 retirement account will lose 40 to 60% of its purchasing power, even if nominal values rise. He's on track to experience what Eleanor Vasquez experienced from 1971 to 1986. Not because he's foolish, because he doesn't know the pattern exists. And by the time he recognizes what's happening, the transfer will be complete. Contrast David with Ann Williamson, 51 years old, lives in Nashville, family physician, earns $280,000 a year. But Anne's financial structure looks different. She has $340,000 in retirement accounts, split between real assets and international holdings. She owns 3 rental properties with $1.8 million in fixed-rate mortgage debt. She holds 20% of her liquid savings in physical gold and foreign currency. Anne didn't make these choices because she's smarter than David. She made them because her father was a currency trader in the 80s, who taught her one lesson. When governments talk about flexibility, convert claims to assets and savings to debt. Anne is positioned like Jennifer Nakamura's father was in 1971, like the institutions that benefited from both previous transitions. If the pattern repeats, Anne's debt burden falls in real terms, her real assets appreciate with inflation, and her diversified holdings protect purchasing power. Same decade, same economic environment, completely different outcomes. The only variable is understanding. Here's the framework I'd suggest, and this isn't financial advice, it's a thinking tool. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, what percentage of my wealth is held in currency or currency-denominated claims versus real assets? Second, if the dollar lost 65% of its purchasing power over the next 10 years, like it did from 1971 to 1981, what would happen to my financial position? Third, am I watching what central banks are doing, or am I listening to what officials are saying? Those 3 questions won't tell you what to do, but they'll tell you whether you understand the system you're operating in. And understanding the system is the only advantage that matters when the system is changing. But here's the contrarian point that explains why most people won't act even after watching this video. The pattern requires you to position yourself against consensus, against official guidance, against what feels safe in the moment. Thomas Whitmore hid gold when the government said surrender it. Jennifer's father moved into foreign currency when officials said the dollar was stable. Robert Ashford bought $400 million in physical gold when his partner said it was a dead asset. Every person who survived these transitions had to do something that felt wrong at the time, that contradicted expert advice, that required them to trust pattern over authority. Most people can't do that. Not because they're stupid, because social pressure, institutional trust, and fear of being wrong are stronger than intellectual understanding. Which means most people will watch the preparation, recognize the signals, understand the mechanism, and still hold currency when the announcement comes, because acting on the pattern feels too contrarian, too risky, too outside normal behavior. That's not a judgment. That's psychology. And that psychology is why the pattern repeats successfully every generation. Margaret Chen, who we met 60 minutes ago, is now paying attention. After receiving that letter about her pension, she called her financial advisor. She asked about the pattern, about gold revaluation, about whether 1933 and 1971 could happen again. Her advisor said, and Margaret recorded the call, so this is verbatim. He said, "That's ancient history. The modern financial system has safeguards. You're worrying about things that don't apply anymore." Then he recommended she move more of her pension into stable value funds for safety. Margaret thanked him and hung up. Then she called her grandmother's financial advisor from the 1970s, the one her grandmother had fired in 1972 for giving the same advice. He's 91 now, retired. She asked him what he'd do today. He laughed, not mean, just knowing, and said, "The same thing I told your grandmother to do in 1970. Watch what they're accumulating, not what they're saying. And remember, the system doesn't announce transfers, it completes them, while you're still deciding whether to believe they're possible." The pattern across 3 monetary transitions is consistent. Step 1. Insiders accumulate assets or position against currency, while officials maintain that everything is stable. Step 2. Policy changes suddenly, framed as necessary, temporary, beneficial. Step 3. Wealth transfers from currency holders to asset holders, from savers to debtors, from trusting citizens to informed institutions. This happened in 1933. This happened in 1971. And the same preparation visible before both transitions is visible now in 2025, if you know where to look. Central bank gold accumulation, legislative preparation for revaluation mechanisms, the gap between what officials say publicly and what they're doing institutionally, all present, all measurable, all following the same sequence. I'm not telling you what's going to happen. I'm not predicting dates or outcomes. I'm showing you a pattern that is repeated twice and asking whether you see the same pattern forming now. The choice of what to do with that information, or whether to act on it at all, is entirely yours. But understand this: the transfer doesn't require your belief to function. It doesn't need your consent. It happens whether you recognize it or not. The only thing your recognition changes is which side of the transfer you're on when it completes. Ruth Morrison trusted the system and lost everything. Thomas Whitmore watched the pattern and saved his family. Eleanor Vasquez followed expert advice and died poor. Jennifer's father read the signals and built generational wealth. Margaret Chen is deciding right now which path to follow. And somewhere, someone like Robert Ashford is positioning for the next transfer. Not because they're predicting the future, but because they understand how the mechanism works and recognize when it's beginning to cycle again. The greatest trick in monetary history isn't the transfer itself. It's convincing people that understanding the transfer makes you a conspiracy theorist instead of a pattern recognizer.